Hey, so this is my final project for English 391. It's called A Few Things About Autism, the Rhetorics of How We Talk About ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder. So I wanted to start with this sign, kind of as an example of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, just because it's something that I've actually been seeing around. It's a sign that was put in the ground a couple blocks from my apartment, and it's up for Autism Awareness Month, which was last month. I think the people who made the sign and the people who put it up were well intentioned, but just the way it talks about autism isn't super helpful, I think, for what they're trying to do for the sake of Autism Awareness Month. So, one example would be the fact that they talk about autism here stats wise as if all autistic people are children. So we get 1 in 44 children are diagnosed with autism. It's more likely in boys than girls. It affects children of all racial, ethnic, socioeconomic groups. Um, and then elsewhere, we get people with autism graduate college, live independently, hold jobs. Like in the future, like that's something that could happen to them given the proper support. Um, but there's really just this kind of assumption here, or not assumption, but glossing over of the autistic community, where we're really just talking about them as if they are all children, and not great considering probably statistically speaking, most autistic people are adults. And it's kind of like ADHD in that a lot of people will just think of it as a problem that kids have or people have during school, but don't really think about afterwards, like about autistic people, ADHD people in the workplace and elsewhere. And yeah, I don't see a lot of conversation about that at all. More often than not, if you look up information about both autism and ADHD, you're going to find a lot of stuff directed at parents rather than autistic people themselves or people with ADHD themselves. And it's slightly annoying as someone who is both of those things, and kind of just frustrating because I'll be trying to look for resources or help on a certain thing, and I'll just find advice on like how to take care of your kid with autism or how to deal with them, etc. So yeah, the callback to like just children, boys, girls, children in this sign makes me think of that, and it's not super fun. I actually ended up writing kind of just a whole Twitter thread, taking this sign apart a bit and looking at each line and what it was saying, what it was kind of implying and assuming. And I think one of the bullet points here to look at specifically is the third one. ASD is about 4 times more likely in boys than girls. I found the study that it was that's referenced here actually. So I'll show you all that in a sec. But TLDR, boys aren't more likely to be autistic, probably. They're more likely to be diagnosed by about 4 times. And I think that's a key difference. Like, if we continue to reiterate statements like this, people are just going to think like that it's more common in boys than girls, and girls will continue to be diagnosed less than boys. Like, in part because people see autism like as something that young boys have. So I found this webpage from the CDC while doing research for another project, and I found that same statistic that ASD is nearly 4 times more common among boys than girls. And I just thought it was interesting that this is one of like the top 4 bullet points that you see as soon as you look at this page on data on autistic people from like a group as big as the CDC. Um, and the second bullet point is also pretty similar to the one on the sign that I just showed y'all. So I think the people who made that sign might have just like looked at this web page and kind of just low key reworded or rephrased a couple of the bullet points here. So I guess you kind of see the importance of these web pages being in like an organization and using the right wording so that we aren't spreading more misinformation. Like, the CDC can have like these couple bullet points on this web page citing someone else's article, and then someone will make a sign about it using a couple of these things that are citing someone else. So you kind of got like a chain of things going, and then they put up a sign like that everyone will see while they walk by on their way to class or work or whatever, or just well out walking, and then like that many more people are seeing this statistic that is phrased kind of weirdly, I would argue. Because like I just said, looking at the study itself from 2020, um, like it wasn't that they tested like thousands of people, in this case children aged 8 years. It's not like they tested thousands of people and found that this many people were autistic definitively and this many people weren't. It's that there were 11 different sites across the US that they looked at in 2020, which also during COVID, so they talk about how that mucked things up a little bit as well. But their study just takes people who have already been diagnosed as autistic at age 8. So they're not necessarily doing their own testing. They're just seeing people who have already been tested in some way. They kind of give some more details here you can look at if you want to pause. But they do note in a section towards the top of the page of this article on public health action that the takeaway from this article isn't necessarily that boys are 4 times more likely to be autistic, so much as the fact that they're noting the changes in these numbers that like girls and people of color as well are being diagnosed. Um, they're we're finding that they're more likely to have been diagnosed as autistic every year with these studies. And they said that that highlights the need for enhanced infrastructure to provide equitable diagnostic treatment and support services for all autistic children. And given that the previous webpage from the CDC was the CDC, like its goal isn't necessarily maybe like activism about infrastructure so much as maybe sharing what it sees as like straight statistics and facts. Um, Also, just sharing like that brief stat that boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed, and then saying that that means they're 4 times more likely to be autistic itself. It's very much just reiterating that stereotype that autistic people are young boys, that and this idea that we really do know a ton, that everything is very set in stone, when we're really still figuring out autism a ton, and really still getting to a point where we're diagnosing everyone who is autistic. They note in the limitations to this article that like they didn't get anybody who wouldn't have been diagnosed at age 8, and like I would be an example of that as someone who got diagnosed at 25. So yeah, not quite age 8. Although if I had been tested then, it's there's a good chance I would have been labeled as autistic just knowing myself back then. And I think this example just shows how important it is that we choose our words carefully and are careful when talking about statistics when it comes to stuff like this, because like it can really change just how like autistic people are diagnosed. Like if people see autism as young boys and don't realize how it manifests in like girls, for instance, then less girls get diagnosed, and then that's that kind of sucks. And then people get diagnosed at age 25 after doing a bunch of their own research, which I'll talk about more later. But um, this has material impacts, I think, and um, being able to like have had access to like resources for autistic people as a kid for me would have been super cool, and it would have made a lot of stuff make so much more sense, and felt a lot more doable and just less wild. So yeah, this stuff's important, and that's one example of um, what rhetoric about autism can do, even if it's just something as simple as how you're citing another study or citing a web page who's citing a study. So after kind of making this whole project and doing the reading for it, I kind of narrowed it down to 5-ish guiding questions that sort of start answering here, or they're just questions that we can't really solidly answer, but I'm kind of encouraging people to think about. So, one, what power is there in the language and media people used to talk about autism? Two, how does the DSM 5 portray autism? Three, how can we talk about autism if not in kind of a negative way? Four, how can we depict autism more completely? And who can we listen to learn about autism aside from the authors of medical diagnostic texts and that kind of thing? I'll explain what the DSM 5 is in a couple moments for the record, but I will talk about just a couple things first. So I thought I'd start with these two quotes, both from the beginning, the first couple pages of books. The first one is Alison Kafer's Feminist Queer Crip, and the second one is M. Remy Yurgo's Authoring Autism. And they were both kind of making similar points that I kind of wanted to start with here. So I'll just read these. These are the first couple lines of Feminist Queer Crip, but Kafer writes, I have never consulted a seer or sidekick. I have never asked a fortune teller for her crystal ball. No one has searched my tea leaves for answers or my stars for omens, and my poems remain unread. But people have been telling my future for years. Of fortune cookies and tarot cards, they have no need. My wheelchair, burned scars, and gnarled hands apparently tell them all they need to know. My future is written on my body. And then the second quote from Yurgo goes, what autism provided was a discursive framework, a lens through which others could story my life. My hand and full body movements became self-stimulatory behaviors. My years-long obsession with maps and the electric light orchestra became perseverations. My repetition of lines from the movie Airplane became echolalia. My very being became a story, a text in dire need of professional analysis. This, my body, this was autism. And suddenly, with the neuropsychologist's signature on my diagnostic papers, I was no longer my body's author. So there's kind of something similar going on with both of these stories from disabled people talking about their experiences, wherein um, other people are looking at them, at their appearance, at their diagnosis, and kind of just assuming that they know X about them because they've seen those things. And especially for autism, this can take the form of not just people looking at you weird or whatever, but um, the fact that the diagnostic criteria for autism, like, is, I'm going to guess, mostly written by people who aren't autistic, but maybe I'm wrong. I could look that up. Um, but there are people who are talking about autistic people and writing the criteria for how people get diagnosed as autistic. Um, I think this is a thing that happens especially with autistic people because people will kind of see autism as the kind of diagnosis where they'll kind of assume that they know more about it than you because you're autistic and therefore less self-aware of like certain things. Or people will kind of assume that they can kind of see the whole picture looking at you from this third person perspective that you yourself can't see. So maybe to you, like you've just got an obsession with the electric light orchestra, but someone else is able to look at you and say, like, this is a perseveration. This is kind of an abnormal obsession with something that a lot of people don't like, or that isn't as common as liking sports or something. And I think that can be taken to an extent, at least sometimes, or maybe on occasion, where what matters when we're writing diagnostic criteria isn't how autistic people actually experience things, but it's how other people see autistic people, which might not sound too weird, but it would be weird if, like, the diagnostic criteria for anxiety or depression were like two-thirds stuff like other people look at you and you seem this way. Instead, they're going to be about how, like, you yourself are experiencing depression, anxiety, what that feels like for you, not like how other people interact with you as a depressed person. So this quote is kind of just reiterating what I've just been saying. It's from an article from Yurgo and Paul Heilker called Autism and Rhetoric. But they just note that in the continuing absence of stable scientific or medical knowledge about autism, we need to shine a bright and insistent light on how brazenly rhetorical any utterance, especially any highly visible utterance about autism, really is. Um, every text about autism and the ever increasing barrage of public discourse on the subject, every news story, memoir, magazine article, film, and so on, every blog entry, every public text on autism is begging for a rhetorical analysis. They argue, like, in this ever changing field where we're still figuring out autism and what it looks like and how we can accommodate it and how we can look at it and talk about it and what words we can use to do so, every word we kind of write about it is important, especially when a lot of people just don't know a ton about autism or X other things, which is going to happen. So, yeah, important to look at these things, and that's kind of what this project intends to do. So, next, I want to kind of think about not just the people who are kind of being framed here, not in a negative sense, but more just we are framing autism in certain ways. In addition to looking at the people who are being framed, we can also look at the framers of it. And one really good article, I pulled a quote from here. I'm not going to remember the whole title, but they note that maybe one explanation of the seemingly endless fascination with autism in popular culture and in scientific literature is its status as an essentially narrative condition. They write that despite numerous and ongoing efforts to identify and locate a biological marker for autism spectrum disorders, autism yet remains symptomatic, diagnosed through the subjective observations of behavior and affect. This means that diagnoses of autism are essentially storytelling in character, narratives that seek to explain contrasts between the normal and the abnormal, sameness and difference. So, in other words, there's no like physical test. You can't pee in a cup, so people can determine if you're autistic. You can't get your brain scanned, as far as I know, and be definitively diagnosed as autistic. So, how people are diagnosed is them talking about themselves and other people, like looking at these stories that they're telling, looking at how other people talk about them and at how they see them behaving. And a lot of this will involve just comparing the potentially autistic person to non-autistic people between normal and abnormal, and I'll kind of show some examples in a little bit. But the fact is that the diagnostic criteria for autism do use words like abnormal and odd, wherein like there is an implied normal that isn't really talked about. But here's another quote that's kind of looking at something else, but I thought it was kind of sort of related tangentially. But this person wrote that we all teach the same primary text and anthologies in our courses, and we frame anything that isn't Eurocentric as marginal. Um, at least, like, that's kind of the standard way that a lot of teaching literature and rhetoric and stuff has gone. But Chavez writes, what if we could reframe our relationship to our disciplinary history and to the canon altogether by acknowledging the narratives that predominate as well as what that dominance implies? So, in addition to looking at like how are artistic people talked about in the diagnostic criteria or in different resources or in signs, um, it's also important and just interesting to look at like if they're calling one thing abnormal, what does normal look like for them? Like, what does that imply? Which can be pretty fascinating in that a lot of like the stuff we see as normal we don't think about like it just comes to a lot of people very naturally. So we can see someone say that autistic people don't make eye contact in a normal way, and then you might think like I don't know, do I look in people's eyes when I talk to them? I'm not sure. um, it's just something that people maybe don't notice unless people aren't doing it. But there's just so much stuff like that out there where a lot of times we or people who aren't autistic don't think about it a lot and don't even notice that they're doing it, but they'll notice when people don't do it. And it can just be really interesting to like see what does it imply about how we see things if we regard this as odd or something like that. So yeah, I'm going to talk about more of that kind of stuff in this presentation. First, had my sign example, and I'm going to share a couple questions that are just kind of guiding this whole presentation. I want to talk a little bit about autism, narrative, and rhetoric. Look at point of view and how that's working in the DSM-5, reframing and rephrasing diagnostic criteria. So if not one way of explaining and diagnosing autism, how else can you do it? How else can you describe it? Who else is kind of doing that describing aside from like medical professionals and that kind of thing? And then conclusion, because that's how things end. So what's the DSM? It stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, and it's, according to the American Psychiatric Association, the standard classification of mental disorders used by mental health professionals in the US. And it's used to diagnose ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and around 70 other disorders. Pretty much, it's a super thick book that's on pretty much every psychiatrist, psychologist's, therapist's bookshelf, and it's pretty much the main standard by which people are going to diagnose stuff like autism, depression, bipolar, ADHD, if I didn't say that already. For some context, the section on autism is about 7,700 words, so kind of hefty. Off to the right here, I just have a list of all the subsections in that section if you want to just get kind of a sense for all the different stuff that um, these criteria talk about. But basically, what this section is doing is trying to really accurately just describe what autism might look like, how you can diagnose people with it, what it might look like if someone has that and another disorder. And they're really just trying to cover all this different stuff so that people are able to identify autism um, in others. This slide is taking a couple lines from earlier in the section where they're just talking about the diagnostic criteria, just kind of listing the main things of what they see as signs or symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. And I kind of just bolded stuff that I thought was interesting to think about a little in terms of how these things are worded. I picked these sections in particular because I feel like they're kind of ambiguous a bit. So, like this first one talks about deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. Um, just the use of words like abnormal, I think, kind of just caused me to question, well, what does normal look like? Is it just that autistic people like approach social situations different from non-autistic people, and is it that descriptive to say just abnormal? um, I also think it's interesting that the word failure shows up so often in this section on autism, like failure of normal back and forth conversation. I think this last line at the bottom we'll get to also uses the word fail, um, but like it's kind of subjective. Like, what does a normal back and forth conversation look like, and is there a way to correctly do it? And what is that? What does that look like? It's not like we really learn explicit rules about these things so much as we just kind of get the hang of them over time, or at least a lot of people do. Um, And I'm also not sure, like, who's regarding this as a failure here. Like, is it that the other person who isn't autistic maybe sees it as a failure at a conversation? Or is it that the autistic person themselves is like, I've failed to get across what I want to get across to other people, or I've somehow, like, botched this whole conversation? Um, that would also be interesting to think about, I think. So in this second bit I took, um, we're kind of just saying more of the same. So I bolded um, that one of the symptoms they list is difficulty initiating social interactions, and clear examples of atypical or unsuccessful responses to social overtures of others. May appear to have decreased interest in social interactions. For example, a person who's able to speak in full sentences and engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fails, and whose attempts to make friends are odd and typically unsuccessful. I think the word odd, especially, is just kind of wild here. Like, what is odd? And like, I guess unsuccessful here would mean that you fail to make friends with somebody. But I guess again, even this is supposed to be an example, but using words like atypical or odd or abnormal don't say anything specific aside from the fact that autistic people just aren't like other people. They're just they do things the way that isn't usual, which isn't super helpful, and is really just measuring autism by how autistic people compare to people who aren't autistic, which can probably work to some extent, but if we're solely doing that, I think that works a bit less. And then this last section is kind of more the same, um, talking about deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction. So, stuff like absent, reduced, or atypical use of eye contact. They note that it's relative to cultural norms. So, like in some cultures, eye contact isn't something you do, except with certain people. Here in the US, like the expected thing is that you're supposed to look everyone in the eyes while you talk to them, or at least most of the time. Um, they also note that like gestures, facial expressions, body orientation, or speech intonation can kind of indicate that people might be autistic or are different than non-autistic people. They might fail to use expressive gestures spontaneously in communication. Um, but I don't know. One, it's interesting because a lot of these things just aren't bad, and it's interesting that we see like these bits of it like as symptoms of a disorder rather than just people like everyone being different. Like some people are super good at sports, and like some people are okay at sports. Some people kind of suck at sports, and practicing can make you better at them. But like we don't have a term we use for people who like I guess we kind of call people clumsy or whatever, but we don't think of that as a disorder really. Um, like it's not a disorder to not be skilled in a certain thing or to not have a knack for something, I think. And I guess that isn't to say that autism is like just this totally great thing that some people have going on. Like there are a lot of difficulties associated with it, but a lot of these difficulties I think like people are kind of making by like talking about all of these things as being abnormal and odd rather than kind of embracing that a little more. And I think it's also kind of a difficult way to like diagnose or think about diagnosis for yourself. Like it's hard to be able to look at this and see like do my conversations with people generally fail? I don't know. Like what am I trying to do? What's the goal there? Did other people think that that conversation failed? Um like very subjective, I guess, as well. Like when I got screened initially for autism, I just thought it was interesting that quite a few of the questions were questions about how other people saw me. So like, how do other people see the way that you greet them? Like, do they see that as normal? And like, it's just interesting to think about because like, if it wasn't normal, would I know? And even if I did, I don't know. Like, if I did, is that something else going on? Anyway, it's all super confusing, and um, they're definitely doing their best here with the DSM. Like, this is the fifth edition for a reason, and it has a crap ton of authors for a reason. Like, just the work cited for this entry on autism alone has like a crap ton of studies that they're looking at and citing. And like, this maybe is as in depth as we're going to get, or as most things get, in trying to describe what autism looks like. But it's also interesting, I think, to look at like what could be changed, like in these um, entries, and like how these entries are really working for people or not working. If I had more time, I was going to look at all the different entries throughout the DSM, like the additions, and see how they're the way that they talked about autism changed because I've heard that it did, but didn't have time to do that as of yet. But anyway, it's interesting at the very least. If I could quick add another quote here too, I think I would just add one of the ones where they're thinking about what some people call like the hyper fixations or obsessions or whatever that autistic people experience, because the way that those are talked about in the DSM as well are kind of pathologized. Like they're kind of described as autistic people being interested in weird things to a weirdly obsessive level. Um, and like that's one way to describe it, but you can also just phrase that as you're super passionate about some stuff and really just want to talk about it with everyone. Like Yurgo mentioned Electric Light Orchestra in the movie Airplane and always quoting from that movie. Like we can think of these things as obsessions or we can think of them as passions. And like it kind of just depends on like the word choice there. And I don't know. I can't really expect the DSM to be more like full of quotes and personal experiences, maybe because that's kind of not how the thing works. But I guess I would argue that I don't know. Like it'd be cool if there was like I or I should say there definitely is a lot out there from autistic people themselves that I'm going to get into in a couple slides. But I don't know. I guess like just looking at the DSM alone is a little depressing until you're finding that other stuff from autistic people themselves, or not depressing, but just kind of unrelatable as well. In that, like I looked at it back in high school and was like, well, I'm not like obsessed with things like that. I don't think, and I'm not that strange, etc. And now I can kind of look back at my younger self and be like, oh, you were immensely autistic. Um, but yeah, so in that sense, not helpful, but also like it is a manual meant for like psychiatrists, psychologists to use rather than lay people. Like it's not even free online. Like to buy a copy costs a decent amount of money. So I'm not really the audience for this entirely, but also kind of am. I mean, like I still like years ago and now have been looking at these criteria just when thinking about my own autism. So as another way to look at that whole entry in the DSM, this is just a word cloud that I put together of the most common words that show up in that section. So, autism is the biggest one, individuals, also children, which is interesting. So, like, we're still kind of getting like that focus on like what autistic children are like versus autistic adults. I don't know if adults is like smaller, a little bit below that. And then we get et al. Super big because it showed up a bunch and we're excited. But I just think it's interesting to see the terms that show up again and again. The bigger ones are used more often. So, like disorders, impairment, deficits, without individuals, um, I don't know, accompanying genetic impairments, psychiatry, interaction. Um, but I think it's interesting. Like when I first made one of these word clouds, I did the same thing with the entries on bipolar and ADHD, and they didn't look the same. Like it's not like the words impairment and deficits show up a bunch, even in the entry on ADHD, which has deficit in the title, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Um, like it is like a little, at least from the examples I looked at, unique that like these terms are getting used in this article, and I just think it's slightly telling that like when we're thinking about autism, a lot of what we're thinking about is impairment and deficits, like what people don't have, which is usually in compared to people who aren't autistic, and a lot of times like these deficits like aren't necessarily even deficits if we look at them a certain way. So it's funky stuff, and I don't want to imply that like autistic people are just like non-autistic people and that we don't need any help and or support and that like all autistic people are I don't know like doing just great because Not immensely, especially looking at statistics about like how many autistic people like have full-time jobs and that kind of thing. But like just looking at myself, like most of the time I'm not around other people. Like my autism isn't defined by how I act with other people or in other people's eyes. Like it's how I feel and be like alone in my apartment, like what I'm interested in, what I'm not interested in, like how I act when I'm alone. It's not just about all of these kind of social things. And I guess it would just be interesting to see, and it has been interesting to see accounts from autistic people themselves and really just getting like that first person. This is what it actually feels like versus this is what it looks like from the outside. Heilker and Yergo in their article Autism and Rhetoric actually kind of talk about this a little bit. Um, and they've got some snark here, I guess. They argue in a flagrantly arrogant construction. Scholars suggest that autistics cannot read or write in a rhetorically effective manner because they are empathetically challenged, because they lack empathy for neurotypical readers. Yet, neurotypicals can write and read and write about autism and autistics because their empathy is so fully realized. They understand autistics better than autistics understand themselves. So they're kind of looking here at the fact that, like, a lot of people will think of autistic people as not having empathy, um, or as not like feeling the same way about other people or other people's minds as they do like about themselves or as non-autistic people do about others. But they make the point that like most of the people writing these criteria aren't autistic and like aren't necessarily having like that kind of empathy that they're talking about either. Like they're looking at things from their own perspective, and feeling that they understand autistics better than autistics understand themselves. So off to the left here, I just have a little model taken from Wikipedia of the not the heliocentric model of the solar system, but the geocentric one where Earth is in the middle. And I was kind of using this image in an earlier assignment for this class, just as an example of one way I was kind of thinking about how um, this DSM entry reads. So, like when we use terms like odd, abnormal, like we're kind of just making it as if I don't know, non-autistic people are in the middle, and autistic people are just like this weird blip that's kind of just circling around them. So like we see in this image, like the sun is going around the Earth, but in actuality, like now all our models will have the sun in the middle, and the Earth goes around the sun. Um, but like it's just like this weird shift in perspective where like people used to think like Earth is the normal, everything revolves around that, when in reality, like it's not it just doesn't go that way. Like you can technically like map out the stars and predict some things where the planets will be even using this model, but that's not what it looks like from the outside. That's really just what we kind of thought it looks like because we were just writing from this point of view that Earth is in the center. So it'd be interesting to think about like with the DSM, if we were going to try to like make that move from geocentric to heliocentric, like what would it look like if we kind of like rewrote or rethought that entry or the diagnostic criteria entirely, um, not just as like comparisons to non-autistic people, but just kind of seeing everyone as the little spot in the middle, or maybe everyone's Earth going around the sun. I don't totally know how I don't think it totally transfers as a metaphor, but thought it was interesting, and also it's kind of pretty. So here's a quote that's kind of just about disability in general, but it's from an article from J. Dolmage, and they talk a little bit about just the mythology around the Greek deity Hephaestus, um, and they note that the idea that Hephaestus's physical disability could have had positive connotations seems contradictory to the modern reader, but they argued in that article um, that this is kind of a result of importing our own bias into the past. So Hephaestus was robustly worshipped and celebrated in the Greek context. His bodily difference not fetishized or diminished, not overcome or compensated for, but idealized. A major temple and a festival were both dedicated to him. Disability throughout history has not always represented loss, punishment, perversion, and alienation, but has instead often been seen as an embodied reality, a physical eventuality, even a desirable human variation. Um, and yeah, kind of just another quote where we're just thinking like, yeah, a lot of disability like doesn't have to be phrased as like this loss, this punishment, like something that's abnormal. It's something that happens to everyone with time, with age, with experience. And if it's so natural, like why do we have to think of it as a bad thing? Which can often be difficult, maybe because disabilities like can have pain to experiencing and having them. And then again, a lot of these disabilities are like just worsened by the worlds around us. Like one example would be I saw a Twitter thread a couple weeks ago thinking on like how less people were diagnosed as having ADHD like back in the 1920s or something. But then it was kind of easier to have ADHD and be a person doing things because like you weren't doing all these different gig jobs at the same time like people do now, kind of just going from place to place and doing all these different tasks. It could be kind of simpler in that respect. There were less like choices to make. You kind of just were herded maybe into like specific jobs and stuff. And like it wasn't as much of a thing that people would need to really micromanage their time and think like I have these 10 assignments due for these different things and I need to figure out how to do them. Like a lot of jobs were kind of simpler than that. And even now there are a lot of jobs where like ADHD like isn't really going to be a disability, like in the sense that it's not operating as one, in the sense that like it's not going to get in the way of some jobs. Like some jobs like it's just not a factor in the same way that like being in a wheelchair won't be as much of a factor in jobs like where people are at a computer the whole time maybe, and like it's not required to stand or like be somewhere in person. Another example people use a lot is that of glasses. Like it's technically a disability, but almost no one really thinks of it that way because it's so accessible nowadays for most people to just get a pair of glasses and then you're able to see. It's not something that like continues to get in the way, or that people have trouble like getting glasses because they're too expensive, like people do wheelchairs and like other assistive technology like that. Like we don't even really regard it as a disability anymore, and I just took off my glasses for some reason to gesture that out. Yeah, if you haven't heard about that yet and you're for some reason listening to this presentation, um, thanks for listening. But um, I think for more info on that, just looking up the social versus medical models of disability will kind of get you more of that type of information. I think I've rambled enough with a lot of these slides that a couple of them are just becoming, as I look at them again, will doing the voiceover for these feeling kind of repetitive. But we're just going to keep trucking along. Um, this first bullet point is a little bit from that Yurko quote from before that mentions electric light orchestra and airplane, but it's not in italics here because I copy pasted it wrong, and that's horrifying. But that's okay. It's in italics in the second bullet point. Um, but I just thought it was an interesting thing that this line was fairly easy to just reframe and rephrase. So instead of my hand and full body movements became self-stimulatory behaviors, we can also just look at that in reverse. So like instead of thinking like of these things as self-stimulatory behaviors, they become movements, they become interests, obsessions, loves. Echolalia can become quotes from Airplane. And that's not like just rephrasing for the sake of positivity and making things sound nicer or feel nicer, but I think it also like doing phrasing things both ways can describe autism more accurately and completely. So I think both ends of those kinds of statements can kind of be doing different work to the ideal end that more people, like if they're autistic, will be able to look at um, different like stories, resources, and recognize that they're autistic, or more people will be able to be diagnosed, or people who aren't autistic will maybe just be able to like better talk about autism and like interact with autistic people. Basically, both is good. It's helpful to look at how people view autism in the third person, but it's also immensely important to look at how autistic people describe it themselves, just so that you can kind of get both sides of it, how it looks from the outside and how it looks from the inside. So I talked about this a little bit before too, um, but here's another quote from that Autism Rhetoric article. Heilger and Yergo say that um, understanding neurotypicality as a rhetoric legitimized autistic ways of communicating. Such an understanding involves calling attention to normalized discourse patterns frequently portrayed as desirable and ideal. It involves calling attention to ways of being that are not the ways of being. So, in other words, like learning more about autism can let us learn more about like people who aren't autistic and what do those kind of like normalized patterns of communication look like, and how can we note that like they aren't the one way that you're supposed to be or talk to people necessarily. And I thought it was interesting that um, this had a lot of the same vibes as how asexuality studies has looked at examined questioned sexual norms. So I included a couple of the first couple articles I thought about in that respect here, but I they're just kind of doing similar work of like taking the fact that asexuality exists. So like ace people are out here, and we don't necessarily like need to assume anymore that like everyone experiences sexuality in the same way that everyone experiences sexual attraction to other people, and like just the study of asexuality has kind of led us to this ability to kind of look at things the other way. So not just looking at ace people, but looking at people who aren't ace, which is most of the people out there, and like noticing what kind of norms are out there for people are like quote unquote supposed to or expected to be or act or feel. So yeah, like I've said a couple times, I think it's important to like just look at other places and learn about autism in places other than just the diagnostic criteria and statistics like that. So this top quote is from an article by Luming Mao, and they are noting that like serious problems arise when one fails to examine, among other issues, the constructed nature of one's starting point and the inherent power dynamics attending each and every form of representation. So um, yeah, like the constructed, like the idea of odd and abnormal, as it gets mentioned in the criteria for diagnosing autism, like those are constructed ideas that have changed over time, and it's important to notice, like, and note, like, normal to who, like, who is able to kind of like shape what normal means here, what power dynamics are going on there. This next quote is from an article from Pamela Van Heitzma on gossip as this like queer and feminist rhetorical methodology. Um, but they talk about how gossip is a speculative methodology indispensable to feminist and queer ways of relating, could be to the past, um, in the case of that article, but instead of seeking to fix history or queerness, gossip ideally remains open to indefinite suggestion. And I really did like that article and just the idea overall at like the idea that it's not just important to have like books of what we see as facts and statistics when we're learning about something like autism or whatever else, um, but there's also a ton that you can learn from talking to other people, and looking at like documents we might see as casual, um, or just like seeing how people talk about autism like outside of like stuff that's been published. Like what about people who are just like have their own blogs or something, like, and don't necessarily have like the money or the ability or the fame, etc., to publish like these popular books or articles on autism. um, as kind of an example of that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my own path to diagnosis a bit. So, as I mentioned before, like I looked at the diagnostic criteria in high school. That was actually because I heard some family members like had been questioning whether I was autistic and had been thinking about like maybe I could get tested, and then other people were like, "Eh, maybe don't. Like that's not really a thing," or whatever their reasoning was there. Um, so yeah, I didn't get tested like as a kid, like I might have. Um, so my own path to diagnosis was like doing my own research, talking to people, and then eventually talking to counselors about it and getting screened and then diagnosed. I, I think it's interesting that I've seen like over a half dozen counselors, psychiatrists, like throughout my life. Actually, yeah, maybe like not 10, but something close to that. And none of them actually like said like I think you might be autistic, even though like I guess counselor is less designed to do that than someone like a psychiatrist. um, but yeah, and then once I did get diagnosed, I would have counselors be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, like you're just like this other autistic patient I have. um, so I don't know, I just like I want to know that like yeah, even if people like aren't saying like I think you're autistic, even though I've had a decent amount of people like say that to me or about me. Um, it was actually kind of funny that once I started telling my friends that I was diagnosed, I had like just a going list, I think, on my phone of people who said something along the lines of, "Oh, I thought they already knew they were autistic. Like it's obvious." And it was funny, but also kind of affirming to hear other people be like, "Well, yeah, we kind of assumed you already knew." But I didn't actually, even though I have like a decent amount of autistic friends, friends with ADHD, and I went through the whole thing like a couple years ago where I was like, "Do I have ADHD?" And then got diagnosed and tested, and was like, "Oh, I do." And even then, it still took like till last year for me to also get diagnosed as autistic. Because it really doesn't happen like that easily or straightforward, especially after you're already an adult and like a lot less, it's more expensive to get diagnosed. You might not have the insurance for it. Um, a lot of the criteria for autism and ADHD, like, are talking about what it looks like in kids, or part of the requirements for ADHD, I think, is that like you had to have shown signs of it as at a young age. So you've kind of got to find like someone to talk about you as a kid or something like that, so that you can kind of get that kind of evidence. So yeah, my path to diagnosis wasn't that like I had a counselor, a psychiatrist to recommend that I do the thing. It was really just me going out on my own, and like I've linked a couple of the videos that I watched that really got me thinking. The third one in particular, like with the kind of cheesy title, Five Signs You Have ADHD and Autism, was someone talking about their experiences having both, and like how they kind of interacted with each other in like themselves as one person. And I was like, whoa, that's like exactly how I feel about a lot of things and how I experience things. So like videos, just talking to autistic friends, having conversations with them, and also just like knowing them for years and kind of getting a sense for like how they talked, how they acted. um, it was really those things like the internet and friends that led me to eventually sign up to get screened for autism. And the person who did the screening was like, yeah, it would be a decent like, um, you wouldn't be incorrect at all to get actually tested to see if you would be diagnosed as autistic, because you got a high number on this scale that we made. And then after that, like I got tested and it was confirmed, and now like my psychiatrist just like knows that I'm autistic, and we talk about that kind of stuff all the time. But yeah, I think it's an interesting example to just look at this kind of path, in that like a lot of it was just work on my own end that people aren't necessarily going to do or even think to do. A lot of it was doubt on my own end. Like I've I've seen the criteria before. Like I have like I did years ago, and I still just kind of looked at it and thought, well, like I don't know if I experienced this thing enough for like the way it describes it in this criteria, and like no one's ever like told me that I definitely am autistic, and usually people get diagnosed as kids, so if I haven't been diagnosed, then like that probably means that I think I'm autistic, um, or that like I'm mixing it up with what my ADHD looks like, but my last bullet point here was is just that looking at myself post diagnosis, I think even like also kind of clarifies for me that like it's definitely a legitimate thing, like in that I've just been reading more about it, talking to more autistic people, um, doing studies on it, that kind of thing, and thinking about like my whole life and my experiences now, like with terms from studies about autism, like and thinking about like how I experience like sensory overload or overstimulation and that kind of thing as an autistic person. And being able to do that just really confirms for me even more so that um, I am autistic. A friend of mine noted that they'd also seen in like posts and stuff that it was a thing that after you were diagnosed, you felt like you were maybe even being more autistic or felt more autistic than before because maybe because you'd kind of accepted it, maybe just because you've read all these signs and diagnostic criteria and you're better able to recognize them in yourself once you've done that and now you're doing the things. But yeah, I think it comes back to that gossip article a little in that like the ways that I got to diagnosis were kind of through what we might think of as gossip, like casual YouTube videos people posted, TED Talks, and talking to friends, reading posts online, going on Tumblr, Twitter, and seeing people talk about it there, Reddit, and like those definitely aren't the sole places that you should look for diagnosing yourself as autistic. Like professionals definitely know what they're doing, and just looking through a bunch of posts is definitely not a sure way to figure yourself out. But at the same time, like both is good, and like this kind of talk with other people about what autism actually felt um, like was what led me to get diagnosed or to seek to get tested, not like any official means. So I think it's important in that sense, and yeah, it's also just very cool to see like how autistic people like are, I don't know, on the internet just sharing thoughts, also in person, I guess. But it's just very cool to see more and more like work from autistic people, words from them, like not just seeing like movies where the main character is autistic and the whole plot is that they're autistic, but like also just seeing like autistic people on Twitter just posting about their everyday lives and how they're autistic every day and not just like for the sake of a movie plot. Um, it's cool. It's interesting. It's helpful. I think not to just see like snippets, but to just see autistic people as people. But yeah, I guess my point here is that it's important to look at one how documents or texts like the DSM talk about autism, but it's also important to look elsewhere, to look at accounts from autistic people themselves, and not even just like there are so many books out there from like parents of autistic kids or parents of kids with ADHD, um, and less from autistic people themselves, and it's the good it's the good kush, it's the good shit. Um, One thing I wanted to note though was another quote from Looming Mao's article. As we continue to represent the other beyond our own space and time and within an increasingly global environment, we must make it clear that the other is neither homogenous nor unified. Um, just including that quote here just to kind of emphasize the point that um, like all of these thoughts don't necessarily mean that like you should just listen to this presentation and see this as the right way to view things. Like you can't really just look at one memoir from an autistic person and see that as like the way to talk about autism. Like autistic people are myriad and they've all got different opinions and ways of talking about things and different experiences. So don't just read one thing, read a bunch of things. Like see what a bunch of autistic people are like. We're super cool, or some of us suck, but like we're just like everyone else in that sense. So to finish this off, I wanted to kind of come back to that sign again with the bullet points um, listing a few things about autism. And these are just a couple examples of alternative bullet points that could go on that sign. So, um, people of all ages, races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic groups can be and are autistic, rather than ASD affects children of all racial, ethnic, etc. groups. Historically and to this day, women are diagnosed as autistic much less than men. So, instead of kind of reiterating the idea that boys are just usually more autistic, boys have more of a tendency to be autistic than girls, just reframing that as women are diagnosed as autistic much less, and like that's potentially is an issue, like I guess arguably. And then my last two weren't just phrases itself to put in the sign, but just one ideas on how to make things better for the autistic people in your life. So like they mention, given the proper support, autistic people can do this, but they don't really mention what that support looks like. And then the last one, just quotes from autistic people themselves explaining what it is like to be autistic would be badass. Like a bunch of signs like this, but each one of them is a quote from a different person who's kind of like trying to explain autism in a way that like a lot of people don't tend to see it from the outside would also be cool. So yeah, just kind of an example of like what all these ideas from my presentation could kind of look like in actual practice when we're thinking about rewriting and reframing things like this. Another example of what that kind of reframing can look like is I just included a little excerpt from part of a poetic poem type of thing I wrote for an assignment for this class, but I thought I'd just share it because it's kind of sharing some of those similar ideas that I've been talking about, but more in poetry form, and I thought I'd just end by reading these. So, they have a great body, but in that it's recovered from an illness and it's still driving, still trucking, or in that it makes really poetic, autistic hand gestures when excited, sad, curious. A body as in a group of beings, a community of limbs, eyes, ears, stomach, arms, etc., plus chemicals and bones and feelings. Every function stunning. And anyway, here's my work cited. Here's one page, and then I'll show you all the next page in a second. If you want to pause and look at the things, feel free to do so. Most of these are really cool stuff, if not all of them. So yeah, thanks for watching this thing. I don't know how long it is at the moment, but if it was super long, I guess yeah, thanks, and I I did my best, and hope you're doing well. As a side note, I can't remember if I actually showed this second slide or not. I think I did actually, but um, here's the second one of works cited pageness, and hope you're still doing well.